So, hello, good afternoon to you all, and thank you for attending to this webinar on shrinking cities as part of the Future of Cities policy brief. So, welcome to you all. I'm Beatriz Fernandez. I'm an associate professor at the École des hautes études en sciences sociales in Paris, and my role today is to present this webinar. First of all, we'll have the introduction by Alessandro Rainoldi, who is head of the Territorial Development Unit at the European Commission's Joint Research Center. He is working on regional, urban, rural, and innovation policies. He has worked extensively for the Commission's Directorate General for Regional and Urban Policy, namely dealing with the negotiation and management of European Union's funding programs and contributing to the policy agenda on issues related to governance, innovation, and evaluation. He previously worked at the Study and Research Department of a leading Italian banking group and as a freelance journalist. He teaches European Union's structural funds at the European College of Parma. Then we'll have two speakers. We are having two speakers. First of all, Jean-Philippe Aurambout, who is a scientist with background as an agronomy engineer from France. And he has a MSc and PhD in natural resources and environmental sciences from the USA. His research expertise focuses on the modeling of complex spatial dynamic systems to facilitate decision-making. He has worked for 9 years as a scientific officer as part of the Territorial Development Unit at the European Commission Joint Research Center. And during this time, he participated to the development of several policy briefs, and he is one of the editors of the Future of Cities report, which we are talking today. And finally, we'll have with us René Fleschurz, who is working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of International Planning Systems at the University of Kaiserslautern, London's Faculty of Spatial Environmental Planning in Germany. Over the past 4 years, he was the project manager for the European Unit-funded project ReCity, Reviving Shrinking Cities, which has focused on training PhD students to become shrinking cities experts. His research focuses on urban shrinkage, demographic decline in rural regions, participatory planning, planning cultures, and comparative research. So I will let Alessandro to introduce this webinar, and I hope it will be very interesting for you all.
Thank you very much, Beatriz, and happy to be here with all of you today to talk about shrinking cities. I would just like to make a very quick introduction and give you the broader framework of this webinar. Well, as you may know, we are now assisting the third out of 3 webinars organized together by the Joint Research Center and the Regional Studies Association Europe to discuss topics related to the future of cities, and in particular the future of European cities. This is quite a consolidated stream of activity of the Joint Research Center, and in particular the Territorial Development Unit, which I have the honor to lead. In 2019, we have published a fully fledged report on the future of cities. Indeed, Jean-Philippe Aurambout was one of the main editors of that report. And then in the most recent years, of course, COVID came, and we had to rethink a bit on what the future of cities will be, and whether and how the most recent events have influenced challenges and perspective of the future of our cities. So that is why we have thought now to tackle specific topics and publish more agile documents that we call indeed policy briefs. And finally, we have thought of sharing this with you, sharing the findings, the analysis, and engaging into a discussion. We really count on this discussion to be active and fruitful for all. Our work will not stop here. We are in the process of drafting more of these policy briefs, which I hope will be further discussed in the next series of webinars. Just as a broader information, the Territorial Development Unit of the Joint Research Center is working on a number of topics related to cities, urban development, rural development, and in general on places, on how policies impact on places and how places can influence the policy-making exercises. So cities are indeed one of our main items of analysis, but we also try to see cities in the broader territorial fabric of the European Union. And therefore, we try not feed the narrative of the dichotomy between urban and rural territories, but to I would say develop both scientific effort and narrative building, storytelling on a harmonious and integrated view on territorial development features in the EU. So I would stop here. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I would give the floor back to Beatriz.
Sorry about that. So we are starting with the presentation of Jean-Philippe Aurambout, who is presenting the report that we are talking about today. So thank you, Jean-Philippe.
Thank you, Beatrice, for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for attending this seminar series today. Today, I'd like to speak to you about the policy brief of Shrinking City that we developed last year. As mentioned already by Alessandro, this is a continuation of the Future of Cities report that we we worked on in 2019 that explored a lot of issues, and this was an additional set of issues. And as you've heard from Alessandro, more will be coming in the future. As always, this is not the work of a single person. It's been the work of many. As you can see, there's many co-authors who worked on this policy brief, and I would like to thank them all. I would like also to give a special thanks to the councils of the city of Genova in Italy, of Kaunas in Lithuania, and Ostrava in the Czech Republic, because they were kind enough to really answer our question, respond to us, and help us really get a perspective from what the cities themselves are doing. So thank you very much from their side. It was very helpful. Here is a short outline of the presentation. First, I will present some global trends, looking at the picture at the worldwide scale, then focusing in Europe. Then I'll try to investigate what we know about cities. Why are they shrinking? What is the effect of shrinkage on the cities? What are they doing about it? We don't really have a clear answer on, this is the solution. But there are some things that we identify in terms of common needs and opportunities, as well as then conclusions and the way forward. So if we think about cities, most people know that the population is getting more urban. Everybody has heard that the population is now moving globally from rural area into cities. Based on the newest definition of cities, we know that about 75% of the world population is currently living in the area, in urban areas. So there's this perception that, well, cities are growing and the countryside is going down, and that's the case, that's it. But actually, this perception that all the cities are growing is actually false. And now we're seeing an increasing number of cities decreasing. Of course, we've all heard of, the Rust Belt and city like Detroit in the US that have been going down for a long time. But this is not happening only in the US. We also have it happening in the EU, Japan, and also other countries. Here is a map of the global perspective. This is a map of the annual rate of population changes between the year 2000 and 2015. You can think of it a bit like an interest rate on the bank account, except this would be for the population of cities. And a city is considered as being shrinking by definition if it loses more than 0.15% of its population over a 10-year period. So on this map, what we see is the dark blue and purple points are actually locations where cities are shrinking. Globally, during that period, about 1 out of 6 cities has been shrinking worldwide. As you can see, if you look at the US, we of course see this Rust Belt with decreasing cities, but actually if we go down, we can see that we do have also some shrinking cities in South America. If we go in Europe, you can see that Central and Eastern Europe, as well as Spain and Italy also have quite a few those dark blue spots, but we also have some in Africa, across Russia, going into China, where we have a lot of spots, as well as Japan. I think pretty much on the map, we can only identify Australia and New Zealand as not having a problem of shrinking cities. So this is not an isolated phenomenon, and it's happening everywhere. If we look at Europe, where our studies was mostly focused, we have the map here on the right. We looked at the trend change in population, again, with the same definition of 0.15% across more than 10 years for shrinking. We identified that in Europe, for that, the whole period between 2000 and 2018, about 1 out of 4 cities has been shrinking in Europe. Of course, you can see from the pictures, we do also have a lot of growing cities, mostly capital cities in green, have still been growing. If you look at the color in red, we can see that these have been cities that have been continuously shrinking for the whole period. And we can find quite a few of them in Germany, Poland, around the Balkan, as well as in Latvia and Lithuania. We also have in the lighter blue color, cities that shrank at the first period from 2000 to 2011 and then have been growing. These are mostly found in Germany as well as in Romania. And then we have the other group of cities that were growing at the beginning and then have been shrinking. We find them mostly in Greece, in Portugal, and in Spain. So we can see that the situation is quite complex and it varies based on different territories. If we think about population, the percentage of the EU population that lives in those shrinking cities is about 12% of the total population, while the number of cities themselves is about 1 out of 4. So we can see that mostly smaller cities suffer from these issues. And if you look a bit further in the future, looking at projection, it is likely that the number of functional urban areas, so our definition of cities, will reach about 45%. 45% of them will be shrinking by 2050. So it's something that's likely to become worse in the future. So why are cities shrinking? While this idea that cities may be shrinking is new, there's actually been quite a lot of scientific literature exploring the causes of shrinking city. This graph represents a number of publications pretty much that mention different parameters as the main factor. Of course, the reason why cities is shrinking is not due to a single factor. It's usually a combination of them. In Europe, the major factors that are responsible for shrinking cities is deindustrialization, suburbanization, aging, outmigration, and low fertility. In our particular case, suburbanization, which is a process when people are moving from city center to suburbia, was not considered because we looked at functional urban area, which have the city centers and their suburbs. So this was not really captured in our numbers. But you can see that there are things that depend globally. Deindustrialization, you cannot choose whether you city deindustrialize. It's a global parameter, while some are more local, like aging and low fertility. And if we look in the future, I mean, predicting the future is quite difficult, but if we look at two important factors, which are aging and low fertility, we know that these ones are going, fertility is going down in Europe and people are getting older. So those are two parameters that are likely to make things worse in the future. And all over, and it's very difficult to reverse. So we can probably say that even currently stable or growing cities should anticipate or plan for possible shrinkage in the future, because those two major parameters we know are going to get worse in the future. So what's the effect of shrinkage on cities? We can consider it from three different perspectives. There's a bit of a, I guess, a computer metaphor here. One of them impacts the hardware, which is pretty much the building, infrastructure. The second one is the software, the population, and the third one is the mindware, this perception, how the city is seen by others and by itself. From the point of view of the hardware, what happens as the population shrinks? Well, we start to have more building than people. And when you have more building and people, after a while, well, some of these buildings are no longer in use. The people that own it may be dead or may no longer be able to do anything about them. So some of them starts to be dilapidated. You know, you start to have broken windows, broken doors, you may have squatters. Then this decreases the value of the property. The people around this apartment may be moving as well. So you start having a sort of vicious cycle where you have more vacant apartment that kind of expands slowly, this urban blight. Also, from the economic point of view, as you have less people, then you have less services for less local businesses and less local services, which become less attractive. You know, if the bakery is gone or if the main shops are gone, then people are less willing to live in that neighborhood. And also, one of the other problems is that as you have less people, then the city administration has less income. And they have less money then to do new projects of renovation or upgrades and providing essential services. On the software point of view, so on the population point of view, what is happening is that when you lose 10% of the population, usually it's not a homogeneous proportion of the population that moves away. The first one to move away are usually the younger, more qualified population that can easily find a job somewhere else. They're also usually the one in the age group of having children. So once you lose this part of the population, you're left off with, I guess, the higher proportion of lower people or people that are with lower qualification and lower income, which again links to this economic problem. And from the mindware point of view, I guess once the image of a city is very negative, you may have an impact on the willingness of people to move there or businesses. So this again loses this attractiveness, decreases the attractiveness, and you have this kind of negative feedback loop that feeds itself. So what are cities doing about it? Here's some examples of the measures taken. Some of the first measures usually that you see to combat this urban blight is this urban renewal, where cities will spend money to renovate and repurpose vacant building to make sure that things don't appear dilapidated. Often, usually in housing in downtown area or repurposing factory, as the one in the example here. That's a factory I think in the Netherlands. The other strategy is what we call city branding, when we're trying to do some PR activities to try to change the image of the city, making it more appealing, having some events or even commercials to try to change the perception of the city. Another one is what we call right sizing. This is an image. The image here is a Google Earth image of the city of Detroit in the US. You can see we're quite close to the city center. And as you can see on the bottom of the image, we have quite a few apartment buildings or houses that are surrounded by green space. Well, if you were to go back 100 years ago or 50 years ago, this would not have been green spaces. This have been houses. What happened is that the city went off and bought this abandoned building and demolished them to try to convert them to green spaces, or in some cases other purposes as well. And in some cases, those measures are associated with a consolidation of our infrastructure and services. And also, I guess as you go further, you might have incitement to relocate people to make sure the city becomes more compact so that you can provide those essential services. This is something that can be happening quite quickly in some places. I know, for example, the number of, in Japan, I think the number of my head is something like 13.5% of dwellings are currently empty. So you have a lot of these empty houses can represent a big proportion of the stock. One of the issue of those measures of right sizing or urban renovation is that it tends to be expensive. Not only because you have to buy the houses, but in many cases, you have to spend a lot of time to identify who the house belongs to. For example, when a house is abandoned, the city council doesn't receive an email that tells them, okay, the house is gone, you can go and buy it. And the problem is even worse once you have apartment complexes, when you may have, these numerous property owners that you have to go and contact. And this type of measures is mostly focused on visible symptoms. You don't do anything about reversing the situation. Other types of measure more focus, I guess I would say, in-depth measures try to look at economic diversification, reorientation of the economic base, focusing maybe on the development of startup, new technology, creative industries, and tourism. Some work on cultural regeneration. For example, I think this example here of Bilbao, where they put this museum and then you have this development of artistic and creative activities. Usually they need quite a bit of space, but since you have those vacant repurposed buildings, then this is something that can be done there. I would say the other perspective is when you go really to new governance and bottom-up initiative, when you have active involvement of local citizens and measures that are actually taken to increase the quality of life. So changing the perspective from going back to growth to let's focus on social capital, adaptives, try to identify services that we need and adapt them to the population that's there. So that's pretty much what some of the cities have been doing. While we were doing this study, we identify as well some common needs and opportunities. One need that was very frequent, in particular for the cities that go on the path of city renovation and right sizing, is the development of a databases of vacant and abandoned building, because that's something that's very time consuming, and it's very difficult for the city to have a grasp of it. So how to identify, which property is abandoned or is at risk of abandonment? Then what are the contact details of the owner? Has the owner passed away? Can you find who the new owner is? So these are things that are very important for cities to get their hand on. And in some cases, they don't have the tools. And having a common tool could be quite beneficial for cities. The second common need, and which is a bit, it's counterintuitive, is the need for social housing. As you would say, okay, as the value of property goes down, then people have more capacity to buy properties. But as I mentioned before, the fraction of the population that is left is usually the one that has lower income. So they still need help, for example, for mortgages and to get access to property. And in some cases, some of the measures that are taken in terms of urban renewal may lead to gentrification, for example, which then make property further least accessible for the people who actually need it. In terms of opportunities, well, if there's one thing that's going to increase in the future for the shrinking cities is actually potentially the need for new technology in businesses in the area of building material recycling and reuse, as well as brownfield remediation, or how you're going to convert those land uses from urban to potentially green or decontaminate this area. So I would say, if you look at something that is likely to grow, a need would likely to grow in those areas would be in this domain. Then every city is unique, but in those shrinking cities, we have a different type of model. We're used to cities growing, now we have cities shrinking. So these could become environment where we can do experiment and observe what is happening and identify potential alternative system that could be focused on well-being and cohesion of the people living in those shrinking cities. here are some tools and programs and funding opportunities. I would say, I mean, cities are not completely left on their own. And a lot of the cities we looked at have been making use of European Structural Investment Fund in their targeted urban strategies. And there's also some upcoming funds that will support areas which have suffered from severe demographic handicap and for which some shrinking cities may be eligible. So some shrinking cities may be able to get funding to help them adapt thanks to those so those investment funds. Also, I would like to mention activities that were conducted under the Aurambout program, which has been focusing a lot on establishing those transfer network, combining good practices to activate, those unused decaying building stock, how they could revitalize public services, the economy, etc. So there's quite a bit of material already there. But one of the main problems is that I would say the shrinking cities is not a science that's been developed very much. I think the next speaker might speak more of it, but we don't really have, this is the key solution to resolve your problem. It's something that's very complicated. But I think now I'm arriving at the end of my presentation. I would like to conclude by raising key points. I think the first one is that shrinking cities is likely to become a more important problem in the future. So we know it's coming. The problem is that the science of shrinking cities is not there yet. We know how to plan for bigger cities. We can make bigger infrastructure, new transportation line. We don't know yet how to shrink or to happily shrink in cities. So shrink in cities, the effectiveness of some of the measures that have been taken are yet unknown because we don't have enough there's not enough time spent between when the measures have been implemented and the results, and there may be some unintended consequences. However, I would like to stress that based on some of the studies, it's not all shrinkage is necessarily associated with a decline in happiness or quality of life of residents. So there's opportunities to actually change the way city work and still have smaller cities that are livable for the people that remain there, potentially focusing on environmental protection, social equity, and sustainability. And I would like to conclude my presentation with this quote that I found very interesting and inspiring, that dealing with the results of demographic, economic, and physical contraction processes and planning for the future of considerably smaller but nevertheless livable cities is one of the most challenging tasks for urban Europe in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe, for your presentation. We will take question and answers at the end of the session, that is after René Fleschurz presentation. René is presenting the results of the RECITY program, the Reviving Shrinking Cities program, who has been funded by the European Union, but he knows a lot better this program. So thank you, René, for this presentation.
Thank you, Beatriz, for the introduction. Yes, as Beatriz was telling, I'm going to present the RECITY project, where we kind of identified the need for future planners to be ready to tackle these challenges of and for shrinking cities and to train them accordingly. So I'm going to introduce the project in its aims and goals. I'm talking about the project outputs that we have produced so far, and I will also talk a little bit about the individual research that all the PhD students in the project have done or are still on the way of finishing their PhDs. So the RECITY project set out to combine international comparative research across disciplines, because it's not only a problem for spatial planning or architecture, economics or social sciences, but it's really affecting the whole city, and therefore all the different strands of science also have to be involved in its solution. And we wanted to outline the concepts and methods, strategic approaches towards revitalizing those cities. We analyzed case studies, or we strive to analyze the case studies and the path of dealing with shrinking that are already on the way. And we were in search of solutions which are kind of innovative, integrated, and also sustainable. The last but not least part is that we wanted to develop new methods and actual training skills and applications to bring the topic of shrinking cities closer to the general public, but also into the education of new planners. We try to achieve this by provide the new generation of planners with skills that enabled them to utilize those synergies between the different disciplines and advance actually the development of the city and in shrinking cities. We wanted to equip these experts with key scientific research skills and specific skills that were required in shrinking cities, but also to train them for different institutional environments and equip them with the skills to manage working in different areas. As you can see, we actually had project partners from all around the globe, actually from the United States, Mexico, mostly Europe, but also Japan. So basically the areas that are most commonly affected by shrinkage or shrinking cities. And we identified that it's actually a global problem that is not only known in the US and in parts of Europe, but also in other parts like Japan. And as we saw, even more in China and even Africa and the South American continent are affected from that. So the training program actually we developed was that all the early stage researchers, the ESRs, were able to draft kind of a career development plan for themselves. And we supported that plan with local training, network training, and secondments. And providing the local training at the host institution, actually the university where they were working during their PhDs. And the network sessions actually were training schools and research workshops that we organized bi-yearly, so twice a year. And that ran usually for 1 week of intensive work and training, and where all the ESRs and their PIs could meet and exchange their thoughts. The last parts, the secondments, were planned to be 2 to 4 month internships at partner institutions, which unfortunately suffered the most from the COVID situation, which was basically starting at the beginning of the project in early 2020, and was still not completely solved until the end. So the project was hugely affected by this pandemic outcome, as of course everyone's work was. But since the project actually required so much, or was planned for, to have so much international interaction and exchange. Of course, this had to be done remote and on a changed schedule. Coming to the outputs of the project, we were able to publish an edited volume about shrinking cities, where we have actually 30 contributions by almost 50 authors, covering basically the whole range of different topics that Jean-Philippe already mentioned, and that seems to be important and are part of the PhD students' work as well. And another output that we actually just recently released is an actual MOOC on shrinking cities that was published in April 2023. And we developed in collaboration with the RPTU's Center for Innovation and Digitalization in Teaching and Learning. So we kind of try to present the ReCity project and the ESRs with their introduction to shrinking cities and their specific topic that they are working on in their individual research, PhD research, and also which they kind of published already in various articles. The course is, of course, free for enrollment, so a little bit of advertising there. Another very important project output for especially the ESRs themselves was the development of business plans that actually the ESRs were supposed to draft. So based on their research, based on their PhDs, they should think about collaborations and services that they could offer, and develop kind of an enterprise out of this. So quite a few of them already have made actual plans for after their initial jobs to follow up on these first thoughts and to think about becoming more entrepreneurial in this field of work. Finally, another output that we developed is some sort of policy recommendations for shrinking cities that were also focused on the topics of the PhD research by the ESRs. So we have policy recommendations for the development or utilization of social infrastructure, public space regeneration, shrinkage in the European policy debate as a general topic, and also the green economy in shrinking cities. Very interesting and also very recent developments were drafted about the refugee-centered revitalization of shrinking cities and the social spatial inequalities that come along with that. And also more specific to some of the ESR's topics in their PhD research, we have thought about policy recommendations regarding the development of flood resilience or the critical role of interactive digital platforms in the development of shrinking cities. The individual research of the ESRs was centered around 4 thematic pillars that were the conceptualizing, the governing, greening, and the regrowing of shrinking cities. And we had like like these 4 pillars and separated to each of these 3 pillars we had 3, respectively 4 PhD theses that are mostly currently still on their way. So we were thinking about strategies for shrinking cities from the historical perspective and past dependencies, learning from failures of the past, the shrinking smart as a new planning concept, actually comparative research methods and cumulative effects, monitoring the social and geographic conditions of growth and decline in cities, and in the government pillar, the role of spatial planning and regeneration of governance in accommodating shrinkage, strategic planning and policy making for shrinking cities, and actor constellations and the institutional framework in shrinking cities. Regarding the greening topic, we had, we still have work be done on the green infrastructure, productive urban landscape, and citizen participation in developing perspectives for vacant spaces, shrinking cities on the long term, changing patterns of organization and resilience following catastrophic events, managing technical and social infrastructure and planning for shrinking. And in the regrowing part, we have actually the 4 topics: building on knowledge and innovation, the role of bioeconomy in revitalizing shrinking cities, the role of culture-led regeneration in shrinking cities, and the evaluation of European policies for shrinking cities in the light of cohesion policy. And finally, the role of migrants in revitalizing shrinking cities. So you see a lot of the topics that Jean-Philippe mentioned before were actually or are actually covered with various of the PhD theses, some of which have already finished, some of which are going to finish actually next month. And some are still underway and going to be finished most likely in 2024. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, thank you, René, for this interesting presentation. And this is the time for question and answers. And we have 3 questions on the question and answer panel. I'm going to read them in order. So, for the instance, we have 3 questions for Jean-Philippe. So, if you have some questions to address to René, please write them down so we can say them out loud. So, first question coming from Eva Velvontikova. Sorry about that. It's addressed to Jean-Philippe. So you presented some examples of cities, of how cities have dealt with shrinkage. In my opinion, other necessary condition to deal with this matter is to have city government that is aware of the problem and willing to do something about it. Simply to have public administration willing to do something about it, either alone or with the private sector. Do you agree, and do you also have other conditions in mind that needed to be fulfilled in order to solve shrinking city problems? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And I think indeed this perception by the cities and the city authority of where they are on the scale of shrinking city, I guess, is very important. I mean, in many cases, there's a lot of denial, or the goal is to go back to growth. And I mean, this may be possible for some cities, but it's not going to be possible for all. So, I mean, I'll be a bit, the problem of solving the shrinking city problem may not be a problem that I would say we can solve, in particularly in the light of, these aging and the lower birth rate. it's something we have to learn to live with. And I guess in some cities may be able to, redevelop and gain more people, but it's going to be at the expenses of others shrinking cities. So I would say it's a bit a game of some sort of musical chair here, but I would say one of the important components would be to try to learn to live with it, because not all cities will be able to compensate for it. And I think this is one of the important elements that we should consider, is that it's not necessarily bad, and we have to be able to live with it rather than fight it. Of course, some cities should be able to do it, and I think it's very important that cities and government realize the situation and accept it.
Thank you, Jean-Philippe. The second question comes from Daniela Vono, and she said, which data did you use to create the global map on types of cities? For South America, estimations tend to be done based on census data, which are carried out every 10 years. However, data availability at city level is not easy to access on a year base. In addition, for the concrete case of Brazil, cities fought against census results published in 2022, and there is now a law that establishes that for administrative purposes, public institutions should use the population estimations before the last census results were published, as public transfers are calculated based on population size. In a nutshell, I suspect shrinking cities is a much more common phenomenon in the global south than what is shown on your map.
It's possible that the data we've been using is for the global human settlement layer, where they combine satellite imagery with country census. So of course, if the information that was provided by the census was incorrect, then it's likely that the data displayed is incorrect. But in that particular case, I'm not exactly sure what were the sources of information that was used from the census. So it's unfortunately it's quite difficult for me to answer this question. But I would say if you look up the global human settlement, there's a layer that can be downloaded that's been recently updated, and I think the methodology should help provide answer to this.
Thank you. So next question that comes from Nuban Hamburg. Many Indian industrial towns show the population of the core and growth in peripheral areas. Do you have any parallel examples in Europe, and what is your policy reflection on this phenomenon?
Okay, yes, this is a common phenomenon in Europe. I think in the chart I showed, it was the second component of shrinking cities. I mean, globally, if you take the suburbs and the city itself, then it doesn't really change very much. But it's often the case where people move out away from the city center, which tends to be more crowded, more expensive, to a suburban area. I think this was the case in Kaunas, the city we consulted, where they had that problem. I think one of the major problems was that the people coming to the city were making use of the services paid by the city center, and then so this is a common issue. But in terms of policy reflection on this one, I would say I'm not sure I can comment there, because I don't really looked at it sufficiently, because in our particular case, using functional urban area ignored this issue.
Again to you, Jean-Philippe. So this question is from Silvia Iodice. Many thanks for the interesting presentation. I consider very promising the idea to use a database about vacant buildings with complementary info about their features. Do you know about any cities where this has been already implemented?
Yes, at least I know of one, because to do this slide, I was looking for examples. So I know that New York City has one. I know that there's a database made available by ESRI, mostly in the US. I am not sure of other existing databases that are made public. They may exist the local level, city level, but unfortunately, I don't know of anything that would be larger scale, like a European scale database. But I think, yeah, it's something that probably would be very useful for many city actors.
The next question is from Jordi van Herden. Sorry about that. Many thanks to both presenters. I wonder, in the shrinking cities field, is there also any consideration for seasonal shrinking, whereby cities or towns are substantially populated by second houses or recreational use, and thus only full for a small part of the year? Would this imply different measures? Do you see any increases in this kind of places as well? He didn't say who the question is addressed to, so maybe both of you can answer if you have any hints about that.
Well, I can only speak for myself, of course. We didn't actually focus on any of these seasonal shrinking phenomena, but I would guess that this is happening all over the world with kind of holiday towns. For example, in France, the southern coast will be populated during summer with a much larger population than during the winter time. So I think there are already concepts and ways of dealing with these kind of seasonal changes. But of course, it's also a challenge to provide the infrastructure during the populated month and still keep it up during the winter months, for example, or when it's off season.
I agree with René. I think I've seen that less. We did some work in the past on empty building, but more in the countryside. But I think what is happening often is, for example, the grandparents pass away, children inherit a house and they use it as a summer house. And this probably happens a lot in those cities René was mentioning. But I think one of the problems is that when you make a census, people that live there for part of the year, they don't appear on the census. So if you base your infrastructure development based on census numbers, then you don't capture this population, these needs during half of the year. So that could be something to explore, but how to get information on this is probably quite difficult.
Thank you.
Just to add on that comment by Jean-Philippe, I agree that it is difficult to measure this with the census data, but usually the local administration knows about this problem and can kind of adapt and plan to this kind of situation, I would assume. But it's difficult to build a policy around that, probably.
Thank you. So we pass to the next question to Jean-Philippe. Economic diversification can be an effective tool to reverse or manage shrinking. What are the main factors behind diversification? Do you have some examples of successful city leveraging on diversification? What role for entrepreneurs, anchor institutions, multi-level governance, and the like?
Thanks a lot for that question. I think having successful example is quite difficult because, again, a lot of the measures that have been taken have been quite recent. So I could give you some examples of cities that have implemented economic diversification, but whether these were successful or not is probably quite difficult. So that's $1 million or €1 million question, is whether this actually works or not. So a lot of effort has been spent in those areas, a lot of investment in some cases, but the return, I guess we're still waiting to see. Hopefully they're coming, but at the moment, unfortunately, I cannot give you an example of a city that was successful in reversing shrinking thanks to those measures.
Thank you. There is a last question coming from Edinburgh, Christian Surubaru, who asks a question to Jean-Philippe also. On government measures, bottom-up initiatives, do you have any concrete examples of cities doing well on this, and in what way?
The top of my head, I do not, but maybe René has more insight in this in terms of where the students are working, or whether there's key cities that are used as a flagship for this type of research.
Could you repeat the question, please? It's
it's about bottom-up initiatives and governance measures. So if you have any concrete examples of cities that are doing well on bottom-up initiatives.
Yeah, actually there are very few case studies within the project. For example, the city of Haarlem in the Netherlands is trying to solve their vacancy issues with a more bottom-up approach and a change in governance. But also the city of Halle in Germany. I know that was an example in one of the PhD researches. But let me think if I can come up. So these are the two that come up from the top of my head. I think there are more examples for bottom-up initiatives, especially also in the Mexican case studies that we had, where these kind of initiatives are much more important because the government response is not so strong, it is not so powerful, so a lot more has to be done in that regard on a private and voluntary basis.
Thank you so much. So it's 3:30, so we are closing this webinar, and I wanted to thank the two panelists, René and Jean-Philippe, for these wonderful presentations, and you all for your presence here today. Also, I wanted to thank Alessandro for the introduction, and thank you all for your presence or for your virtual presence today. So thank you. I'll see you soon.